There are three things you can do to help us out.
One, you can make sure you subscribe to this channel.
Two is you can leave a comment here or on Apple Podcasts.
And three, if you really want to help, you can follow this link to see how you could be a supporter on Patreon.
Welcome to another Word in Your Ear and a fantastic new book that we've both just read, and we thought it was so original. Actually, we were amazed it hadn't been done before. It's not about musicians on the way up or at the top of their curve. It talks to 50 people about what life is like when your big moment in the sun is over. So it's very sobering and very fascinating stuff, and it's called Exit Stage Left: The Curious Afterlife of Pop Stars. And it's been written by Nick Duerden. Nick is here with us. Lovely to see you, Nick. Excellent.
Hello. Hiya.
So was there an article you read or an interview you did that gave you the idea that there was a whole book in this subject?
I guess the honest answer is there was a series of articles and they were mine. Because I've been doing this job for quite a while now.
Yeah.
I found that I would re-interview the same bands and the same artists over a period of many years. So I interviewed them when they first came out. They're 21 years old. They're full of confidence and ambition. They've got their cheekbones and they've got their lives in front of them. And they just think they're going to take over the world. They're going to be the new Beatles. And then I would interview them 5-10 years later. And of course, life doesn't always work out that way. And I came to find that those interviews were far more powerful than those earlier narratives, because those earlier narratives were all the same pretty much, you know, Brit Awards, Top of the Pops, the cover of music magazines, and infamy forever. But then life happens to them, and marriage and divorce and addiction, and the drummer leaves and the bassist is in rehab again. And I just thought I would come away from those interviews feeling I'd learned more about life for me. You know, I've never really been able to relate to a pop star because I've never been one, but I could relate to what it's like to live
in recovery.
That kind of thing. And I found those interviews fascinating, and I thought, oh, there's more scope here to talk about them, perhaps more deeply.
You feel that pop stars ought to have some kind of advice on this subject. I interviewed Martin Fry once, and he said that when the group split up, ABC, he realized that he had 10 years sort of in the wilderness, you know, playing little tiny clubs in Canvey Island, you know, with backing tapes in his gold lame suit, you know, to about 15 people. And then eventually he would be accepted back in again. Because there is that period, isn't it, when you're just not touched.
Yes, and that must be awful. Yeah, that must be awful too.
Terrible.
What struck me time and again in writing this book was that I interviewed people whose wildest dreams had come true. And in my normal everyday life, I don't tend to meet people whose wildest dreams have come true. So what's it like then when that dream passes? Because you're left with this vacuum that you have to fill. And it can be quite a lonely, confusing place.
No, it can. And there's so many aspects to the kind of the aftermath. You know, one that I hadn't fully taken on board was the idea of debt. And there's quite a few really good examples. Oh, tell us the Frankie Goes to Hollywood story, because that's really interesting. You always imagine they might have made some money, but in fact, very much not the case regarding the second album, wasn't it?
No, they were so successful, and they were very, as I understand it anyway, they may have a different angle to it, but as I said, they were very much a studio band. So as talented as they were individually, Trevor Horn was the mastermind behind it. So the first album, Welcome to the Pleasure Dome, mid-80s, I think 85, maybe 84, 85, just sold millions, and they wanted more creative control for the next one. So the record company and Trevor Horn thought, well, we have to give them something now. So the second album, which is called Liverpool, cost, I think, £760,000 to make, which was a lot of money.
Astonishing amount of money. Yeah, in 1986, where it was.
And so, of course, they had to pay that back with the profits of the record. But when the record didn't sell, they were in hock to the record company forever. So when the band imploded, and I get the sense that the band was always going to implode because there were 5 very different people, they had no money. So within months of disbanding, they were on the dole, or they were working as electricians, and they just went back very suddenly to this normal, ordinary life, suffering symptoms of PTSD. And they only made their money back maybe 10 years later when they got
Greatest hits, what it was. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was incredible. You think, Relax must be one of the most played songs on British radio of all time. It must have made a lot of money for an awful lot of people, but not necessarily for them.
But not for them.
In a timely fashion.
Yeah. I suppose the lesson of that is really, if you have a big success, the thing you ought to do is just stop. Just don't try and follow it, because that's where you lose the money. It applies with absolutely everything. You know what I mean? Yeah. Because the next one is always more expensive.
It's the Terence Trent Darby factor.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm sure you probably find that most bands would recognise this. Your ABCs or whatever. That the first one is very Meatloaf for whatever.
Yeah.
The first one is very often the big one. And then they keep going, and that often costs them money. One of the things that fascinates me about this whole syndrome, and Mark and I were actually out last night. We were talking about this is so much our wheelhouse. This is the afterlife
magazine world. Yeah.
It's a very magazine world, and it's very often, as Mark says, that it's very often a consequence of having dealt with these people when they were absolutely at the top of the tree. Because usually when they were at the top of the tree, they were unbearable.
Yeah.
And so you feel that you're getting even with them a little bit. When you read this book.
And then when you interview them on the way down, they're so
humble.
Courteous and humble
Yes.
and eager to please and grateful to see you.
But what about regardless of the money, there's the question of the kind of prestige of the public arena, the public perception that goes along with, Santa's had a couple of hits, been on top of the pops and done whatever. And therefore they feel the world looks at them in a certain way. Mm. And then it stops looking at them in a certain way. And they have to deal with that. You're right about this, particularly in the case of, I was very struck in the case of Lloyd Cole.
Yes.
Tell us about this.
I love that story because he told the story with such poignancy and, as you say, such humility. He had grown very used to being recognised wherever he went and fawned over. And of course, as a pop star back then, he complained about it all the time. The moment it was withdrawn.
He complained about that?
Yeah, but the moment people weren't getting whiplash by turning out, is this Lloyd Cole? He was utterly poleaxed. Lloyd Cole and the Commotions had done really well in the mid-1980s, one album after another. He says now that there were too many albums too quickly because obviously the record company wanted to milk their success. So they were caught up in the bubble that I suppose all pop stars are. And then he wanted to change. So instead of taking time out, he flamboyantly quit and moved to New York. He stopped being a pop star and wanted to be a bit more Lucian, a bit more rock star, and made a solo album and came back to London on a promotional trip, walking through Soho to the Groucho, where he still held a membership, and realised that as he was walking down the road, no one was looking at him. No one wanted the
so bizarre.
And that's a unique human experience.
It is.
Being shocked that people don't notice you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I can only dream about what it must be like to be a VIP. A lot of these people were VIPs from the age of 20, even younger.
Yeah.
Then it's taken away from you. You're returned to Civvy Street, and nobody cares anymore. It's almost like that saying that when you've gone first class in an aeroplane, when you've turned left once, turning right thereafter is incredibly difficult because what's
you've seen what the world is like. Yeah.
So Lloyd Cole was, I think, 30 years old, and he thought, oh my God, that's it. I have another 60, 70, 80 years on this planet, and it will never be as good or as exciting or as thrilling as it was then. And so even though many artists do move on and have a very rich afterlife, I suppose they can't help but hanker back to that time of incredible excitement simply because nothing else comes close.
Because it's like Gary Lineker, the footballer. I heard him in an interview say, scoring a goal in a major game is, don't tell the wife, but it's better than sex. There is nothing that will ever compare. Now, footballers spend the rest of the life, they hang the boots up at 34, and they don't worry about it anymore. Pop stars, they're still stuck with the job, aren't they, really?
And they can still do it. Well, Keith Richards always says that thing about going out and playing the first major chord to 68,000 people in the stadium, what that feels like, you know, and how addicted to that you become.
Well, one of the early prompts, I suppose, for the book was me reading the Viv Albertine book, Clothes, Music, Boys, which I loved. I thought it was an incredible book.
Yeah, really good book.
In my memory, it's 400 pages long, and the first 200 pages is all about the punk years and the Slits and what that was like. But so much more fascinating for me was what happened next. And you know, the band walked away. She was utterly bereft. I think she likens it to the end of a marriage.
Yeah,
and
eventually
she goes back, but she's in the pub circuit again. So she's had all this glory, this incredible, you know, the punk years where I suppose not much really compares to that, to playing the Dog and Duck in Wolverhampton on Thursday night to 12 people. And even though it's lovely to be up there on a stage, even if it's just a small stage, 6 inches above everybody else, it doesn't, as we said before, it doesn't quite compare to that visceral thrill. So many of the bands that I interviewed in the book end up reuniting, getting back together with the band, because they don't want the Dog and Duck in Wolverhampton, even if it's a great venue. They want Wembley again. They want Madison Square Garden.
And there's quite a few examples in the book of people having that realization halfway through their career, not while the whole thing is kind of over. You know, there are 2 really good examples. I think one is Suzanne Vega going out on a 3-year tour, and in the time they spent.
Oh God,
Tell us that story. It's really interesting.
I love that because she was so lovely and so giving and so candid and open. And she'd spent, if I remember correctly, I think she'd spent 11 years trying to get a recording contract. So she started in the mid-70s.
Yeah.
They all said she was too austere and too folk and too plain. And then the 80s came with its makeup and its shoulder pads and Madonna and Cyndi Lauper. But she stuck to her guns and she became really famous and really successful. And because she did it her way, there was this real sense of achievement. So gradually she decided to switch things up a bit, and she got confidence. So in 1990, she launched her a new album, her biggest tour to date. Instead of just it being very sparse and acoustic as previous tours had been, she employed a backing band. She employed, there was going to be different costumes. So there was a costume designer backstage. And I think her first show was at Radio City in New York, and it was half full. And she kept on thinking, well, surely people are in.
Yes, the 3-year tour. That's right.
Because she didn't know until she was on stage, really, did she?
She didn't know. And that set the tempo. And she realized afterwards that what her success previously had done was told record companies that there's nothing quite as powerful in music as just one person with a guitar and an awful lot of emotion. So in that time, Sinead O'Connor,
Tanita
Tikaram, Martika, all these
Tracy Chapman,
and Tracy Chapman, the obvious one.
Yeah,
so they were all playing at similar times. So her notional audience were going to see those acts instead. So within a few weeks, Suzanne Vega was hemorrhaging money. So she had to let the dancers go. She had to let the backing singers go.
Oh, it's so sad.
She had to let the costume designer go, and she kept on reducing the shows and then reducing the amount of shows. And then the final kind of nail in the coffin was when she returned to New York. She, got way through customs and was looking for her car that the record company unfailingly sent for her. And of course, it wasn't there. There was no placard saying Suzanne Vega pop star, because she wasn't anymore. So she had to join the queue for the taxis and make her own way home. And so that was her, returning to her with a bump and thinking, right, I have to go about things another way now. My time.
Heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It's also a reminder, that particular story, of the fact that everybody else involved in that enterprise is making money off her.
Yeah. Yes.
The singers are getting paid. The stylists are getting paid.
Yes. And she's
the record company are kind of getting paid.
Yeah.
She's not.
Not losing out.
And as you said earlier, that the record company know that there is a slide, but nobody thinks to tell her. So I also interviewed Kevin Rowland from Dexys Midnight Runners.
Oh, that's so sad. There's a bit where he talks about suddenly the people in the record company stop saying, hello, how are you?
Yeah, because
they stopped talking.
They used to look up from their desks as he walked in, because Kevin Rowland, the pop star, has turned up. But obviously they'd had a meeting in his absence and think, oh, he's over, he's well over. Don't talk to him, don't mention the war almost. So he would walk through expecting, Kev, mate, hello.
Yeah.
Nothing. And he's got, oh my God, the writing's on the wall, but why isn't anybody telling me? And they don't, because I suppose it's a fast moving industry and they have already moved on and you are now superfluous to their needs. So it's
so brutal.
Yeah. But it's also, I know it's kind of brutal, but also, don't you think it's because you are simultaneously a product and a human being? And so people in record companies, they try and get on with people. They try and be matey with the artists. Why would they not? But the problem is, at some stage, when the artist doesn't sell enough, they're going to have to stop being matey with the artist. It's just going to happen, isn't it?
But they don't know. They don't have the language to talk to them to say, no, it's not happening anymore. You had a good go, but now can you move?
It's not you, it's us.
It's not you, it's us. Exactly. Yeah. I know. Do you remember that old gag about the 4 stages of showbiz? Do you remember that? You can put You know, it's kind of it's brilliant. It's kind of, so say it's Terence Trent Darby. So the first stage is, who's Terence Trent Darby? And the second stage is, get me Terence Trent Darby. And the third stage is, get me the new Terence Trent Darby. And the fourth stage is, who's Terence Trent Darby? Yeah. And that all happens in about 18 months. Yes. Actually, in his case, it really did.
And his story was fascinating. I still remember the time. I think you two were Q, weren't you, when you pushed the cover? And he was naked but for a fig leaf. And we hadn't seen that level of artistry, I guess, and talent since Prince. It was only a few years, but he was suddenly the world's biggest pop star. So of course that was in his head. So to have that demotion so quickly, but I guess he was guilty of what Prince was guilty of, that it's difficult to rein that ambition in once it's been so flamboyantly unleashed. So he believed that everything he recorded was another piece of genius. And the record company was saying, can you work on it a bit more? Can we pair you with this producer, this songwriter? And so he refused to accept that that was the case. And so he, for a while, imploded and then had to kill off the name Terence Trent Darby, disappear for a few years and come back as Sananda Maitreya.
Yeah, completely reinvented. He was
allowed to mention Terence Trent Darby again. Yeah. That was his way of coping.
There was another moment that just made me realise just how difficult it is. And it's Dr. Robert of the Blow Monkeys. And the bit where describe what happens, because they just don't like the way he looks, do they? And they decide to doctor his pictures.
Yeah, but and
change the colour of his eyes and everything.
Well, basically, he was, as I understood it, he was too pretty. He wanted to be part of Red Wedge. He wanted to fight the cause for Labour alongside Billy Bragg and Jimmy Somerville and Paul Weller. But the record company was saying, well, look, you look really good in black and white. Can we just take lots of pictures and forget the band? The band will be in soft focus behind you. Let's market you as a pop star because this will work. And he realized that very quickly that this wasn't for him. And so, this caused an awful lot of tension between the band. And he had a similar thing to Suzanne Vega, where cars stopped coming for him and he had to take cabs or the bus or the tube. And the band were almost over as quickly as they'd emerged. So they were everything and then they were nothing. And he did something that a lot of the former pop stars I interviewed did. They decamped somewhere else. I found in many ways that they are real stoics, these pop stars, because they don't give up. They considered themselves square pegs then, and they consider themselves square pegs today. Yeah. They're not going to suddenly conform. So he just upped and left with his young family and went to a very barren part of southern Spain, where his wife encouraged him to continue to write songs all the time.
Yeah.
Apparently he's got 10 albums out there, solo albums, that don't seem to be available on Spotify, but they feed his soul, and obviously they don't pay the bills, but he lives the way he wants to live. So every time the wolf is at the door again, he gives in to those nostalgia tours. The band get back together again, perhaps whether they want to or not, make a bundle of money, a bit like old actors on a panto. So it's a fallow time from February to November. They suddenly are very busy in December and January because they're a panto, and that's the way that they live. And to a greater or lesser extent, it suits him because he makes enough money in those 2 months when they play the summer festivals in Henley or alongside ABC and Sister Sledge and whoever else. And then he goes back to his farmhouse and releases more solo albums to his heart's content, and it does seem to please him. He sent, after I interviewed him, he sent me a few songs that sounded great.
Yeah.
Then you feel really bad because you think they're never really going to find an audience. I just wondered whether that was enough for him.
But it's so great. I thought it was so poignant that the record company had changed the pictures to make him, as he put it, look like Morton Harkett. So when he turned up at these concerts, all the girls in the front row looked at him, were incredibly disappointed because he actually looked nothing like the pictures that they put out.
Yeah.
Really difficult.
He didn't play.
Imagine having to deal with that.
Yeah.
You also talk to somebody who seems to be at the same level now as he's always been, who is Billy Bragg, which I thought was very interesting. That Billy did try at one stage to kind of move up a gear commercially, didn't he? But
he tried to be a pop star. I mean, Sexuality, was a hit single, wasn't it?
I think if anybody could teach how to be a career pop star, it's Billy Bragg.
It is.
Yeah, I think he's thought it out really well. I think he owns all of his back catalogue as well. So he's one of the pop stars outside of perhaps Ed Sheeran who actually makes money on Spotify.
But he's also, it was very interesting about how he kind of changed what he had to offer. He wasn't just, he was on Newsnight. He's written a couple of really fantastic books, actually. Yeah. He's got the whole political dimension to what he does. He even sells his own merchandise, doesn't he, Dave? Do you remember we were doing a Zoom with him, and it was during lockdown. He was just, he was finding stuff in the attic and just saying, if you want to buy this old poster from Spy versus Spy, it's yours. I thought it was fantastic.
Because he was saying,
as was Lloyd Cole, actually. Lloyd Cole was writing out the lyrics to his songs, and you could buy handwritten lyrics.
Oddly enough, I met somebody the other day, a near neighbour, who bought some lyrics from Lloyd Cole just the other day and was completely thrilled and was going to the framing shop to have it.
Absolutely.
Because he sits down at his kitchen table and writes them out for that particular client.
Why not?
Entrepreneurial, isn't it? It's you used to be a pop star and now you're an entrepreneur. I mean, Billy Bragg was telling me that his whole shtick was bringing down Thatcher and Thatcherism, and he was a very loud voice during that time in the 80s. So when the Tory party got rid of Margaret Thatcher in 1990, he almost thought, well, my work is done here. I can't.
Yeah,
they've shot his fox, as they.
That's right, exactly.
So he took time off. He concentrated on fatherhood, and then thought, well, what do I do next? And I suppose, long story short, he grew a beard, got more into folk, teamed up with Wilco, and reinterpreted the songs of Woody Guthrie, and rediscovered a whole new audience, which is great. And now, and as you said, he's written books. He will write op-ed pieces for The Guardian to upset people from time to time, and similar on Twitter, basically to remind people that Billy Bragg, in inverted commas, is still here.
Yeah.
I think
you talk about people never give up, and obviously they rarely give up. But you do have certainly one example in here, which I was very interested. Well, I don't know if she described herself as having given up, but I was very taken with the story of Natalie Merchant.
Amazing. Yeah, she was another one that always wanted to be a singer-songwriter, never really cared about the fame. Fame came along and she thought it was awful. And at the height of their success, she had the record company arranging photo shoots saying, would you mind posing in a bikini or in a particularly sexy dress? And she said, well, look, this isn't me. So she eventually left the band to go solo, to have a quiet folk career, and then her first solo album sold 5 million copies.
And then had huge success.
She said, I have to do this all over again. And but again, she's on that kind of roller coaster by that stage. And obviously part of her really enjoys having an audience of 5 million, because frankly, who wouldn't? But then again, at some point she stops and she focused on having a child and then raising, her daughter. And now she seems to have mostly given up music, and she teaches arts and crafts to underprivileged children right across New York State, and she funds it all herself. So she spends most of every week sewing costumes for them to wear at their end of school, parties and performances and song and dance. And she was saying that she looks at people like Bob Dylan and Paul McCartney who are still going out.
Why do they bother? Why are they still going?
I just want to be home in my garden.
Yeah.
But I guess it's you know, it's what you need, what makes you feel good in some
Well,
people.
I think that's
Such
such a big part of it. I can remember interviewing Roger Waters once of the Floyd, and he said that people who want the amount of success that we've had have holes in their psychology which need to be filled with applause. And there's a very small version of it in your book, rather touching actually. It's Edward Tudorpole of Tenpole Tudor, and he talks about how being a pop star gave him the love that his mother never gave him. And how he said for 15 years, he was going out 3 times a week and playing Swords of a Thousand Men or whatever. And he was really happy. He wasn't complaining about it at all.
I love that story. Yeah, I love that story. He told it so well. He described himself as a real life wingman. You know, all he wanted was to be Mick Jagger. And he had an unhappy childhood. He would watch Mick Jagger on Top of the Pops throughout the 1960s and think, I want that. And then he started a band in the middle of punk. He hated punk. He thought it was rubbish. He thought he could do better. And then one day, writing in the toilet in the tour bus to hide from the rest of the band, he came up with Swords of a Thousand Men and thought, oh my God, I've just written a hit single. And so it came to pass. It was a massive hit single. The band got on his nerves. He had an argument with the drummer. He thought, well, I don't need them. I'll do it myself. I'll just find another toilet, another tour bus, and I'll recreate that magic. And it didn't happen. It was so some kind of magic happened in that moment.
Yeah.
Never to be repeated. So he went back to acting. He almost got with Mel, but he lost out. He was down to the final 2.
Yeah, he auditioned, didn't he?
Yeah, and Richard E. Grant got it. And he doesn't like nostalgia. He doesn't like punk, but he realized that this one song, this one slice of magic that he managed to conjure up out of thin air could basically fund his life for the rest of his life. So until lockdown hit, he was out at festivals that he particularly didn't want to go to, but had a whale of a time being cheered at. And then he tells me that he could go into any pub in the land and people would turn around and say, hey, aren't you that fella? And they would buy him a drink. And he's
It's like,
what more could you want?
So the classic case of this whole thing is fascinating. How long ago is John Otway and Wild Willie Barrett appearing on the Whistle Test? About 1974, wasn't it? I think it was earlier.
Earlier, actually, yeah.
Doing Really Free, which everybody in the country who watched it following day was talking about it. He's still living off that.
Totally. Off that 5 minutes, wasn't it?
It's just absolutely astonishing. It doesn't apply in any other walk of life.
No, had he not got that TV gig, it probably wouldn't have happened at all.
Absolutely wouldn't have happened any other way at all. Because you have quite a few cases of this in the book, because this is one thing that's changed in the last 10, 20 years, I suppose, with streaming and so forth.
Yeah.
Is that very often people can find themselves suddenly the beneficiary of a fortuitous sync deal over a tune on a movie or a commercial or a God knows what. Suddenly it's a payday out of nowhere. Haven't you? This comes up again and again, doesn't it?
That's incredible. Like again, it's the afterlife, isn't it? So one of the most memorable stories for me was Peter Perrett, The Only Ones.
Oh, it's an amazing story.
He was a drug addict essentially, and he couldn't cope with the pressure, and bad things happened on a tour while supporting the Who. He got into an altercation with someone, and like any of us in that situation, got into a car and ran him over because he thought that would be a way of telling him. So he fled the country. The band were over. He took drugs to kind of numb himself from what he had done, because he'd basically, killed the golden goose, and thought, what do I do now? So he dealt drugs and took drugs for the next several decades. But the band's one hit just wouldn't go away, and bands would cover it, and then social media was invented and people would mention it online, and his sons would come to him and say, look, Billy Bragg loves it, REM love The Cure, have done a version. And then I can't remember which, O2 maybe, or one of the phone companies paid him £100,000 to use it in an advertising campaign, which restarted interest in the band. The band phoned him, said, can we have a meeting? Let's get back together. So they were risen simply because this one song from 1977, 78 wouldn't die.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had died, but the song hadn't, and the song had resurrected him. It was
I love it.
Yeah.
I think you got the image in the book of they all turned up on his doorstep, didn't they? They were suddenly.
Yeah.
I thought the idea. I mean, the only ones kind of looked. They looked on the last legs in 1977.
I know. If you had
God
to give,
knows what they would have looked like 30
you would never
years
have got short odds for believing that all still be alive.
Because Mike Kelly, of the only ones, was the drummer in Spooky Tooth.
Yeah, he was.
So he was around in 66, 67.
Wow.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it really fascinates me, this whole business. I'm sure Nick Lowe, I'm sure if he could ever do a lifetime accounting, he'd probably find that he made more money out of What's So Funny About Peace, Love and Understanding being fortuitously used on the bodyguard than he made out of everything else.
Everything else put together. It would have been.
So they're going to have years making literally nothing. And then suddenly the postman turns up.
Yeah.
And there's an inheritance from an aunt you didn't know you had or something.
Well, one of the people I interviewed in the book was C6 Sputnik.
That's a brilliant chapter.
Tony James.
Because Tony James invents a kind of character that's just not really what he is, does he? It's just more capable.
I'd gone expecting a cartoon caricature because that's what I remember from C6 Sputnik. What I found was somebody who looked like a very wealthy, clever advertising executive who knew exactly how to market himself and routinely licenses. What's the Generation X song?
Dancing with Myself, isn't it? Isn't that the one?
They constantly sell it for £1 million here, £100,000 there, and he lives maybe not quite the life of Riley, but not far off it, simply because of that one song. So he had all sorts. He wanted to be Malcolm McLaren. So maybe his deeper streams didn't quite come true, but he did hit pay dirt, and that has facilitated everything that's come since. Of course, the flip side to this is how they balance that out with their ongoing creativity, because every artist I spoke to were convinced that they got better and better through time because they knew how to play the guitar better, how to songwrite better, and they were furious that nobody really gave a damn. They wanted to hear the old songs because music for us is a snapshot. It takes us back to a time and place. I always remember going to see, I think I've seen the Rolling Stones twice in concert, once in 1990, another time in 2005, and it was essentially the same set. But in the middle of the 2005 concert, I think I'm right in saying this, Keith Richards did a little solo of some new songs, and it was in a stadium, so a lot of people, I just watched them all get up en masse and either go to the or to the bar. Didn't
he play 2 songs in a row? I think he did. That's his mistake, because that's been talked about a lot. If Mick had said Keith's going to play a song for, he said Keith's going to play 2 songs now. I never thought I'm going to go and get a burger and make some telephone calls,
because I'm damned if I'm going to miss Jumping Jack Flash or whatever.
Now's the chance to go to the loo.
But that must be so hard to take if you are a creative, and you would know this more than I. What does Paul McCartney think? If he releases a new album and he thinks this is really good, I'm really good at what I do still.
Yeah,
people will appreciate it and nod wisely, but then go back to as Alan Partridge would have it, the best of the Beatles.
Yeah,
again.
I think it's interesting too that somebody, I think it's Rasheen Murphy, talks about the idea that you're never completely satisfied with what you've achieved, and not only are you not satisfied, other people aren't. The public aren't. The public always think you should have done better or whatever. And I think I can't think of very many examples of people who came out of it all completely content with how it went. Yeah. There's not that element of if only this had happened.
You need to have something else to compare. And I think what everyone finds difficult is that thing to compare. It has to, maybe Natalie Merchant has it because working with children really does it for her. But if you go and get, in inverted commas, an ordinary job, it doesn't quite, even Bob Geldof I interviewed in the book, and he went on to become a wildly successful entrepreneur, made an awful lot of money, and, in the sidelines, fed the world and received a knighthood for it. But he still seemed to derive more pleasure from pulling on a pair of skinny jeans.
Oh, sure.
Getting back on stage,
he still does.
Jumping up and down.
Yeah, because he thinks of himself as a musician, fair enough.
Yeah.
And so he's really mortified. I've interviewed him a few times. He's mortified that nobody wants to go and see the Boomtown Rats because he thinks they're absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, yeah.
And also, I'd never read, it was very interesting, your interview, because I'd never read him talk about the point where it was all over and that no one was returning his calls. And he was just because you kind of thinking of him as being successful all the time and prominent, but he wasn't.
And of course, he was somebody that wouldn't take no for an answer, even before the rest of the world knew that he was someone who wouldn't take no for an answer. So I'd never heard that story before, and I didn't know if it was something he had told many times. But when the Boomtown Rats looked from a record company point of view like they were over, they'd had more or less 10 years at the top and they were no longer having hits. He was furious and thought, no, it's not my time yet. I still have more to give. So he got the band to travel the country by car. He'd given them £1,000 each to go to as many chart return shops as possible, buy as many copies of the single as possible without being found out that they were diddling things, to get them into the charts, which would get them back onto the top of the pops, back into the public consciousness, and back where they should be. And it didn't work. And so that was the end.
That's the most analog thing imaginable, isn't it? Absolutely. In a car, driving around the country, physically buy, and then coming back in with a false moustache and a coat and buying another one. That's hilarious.
But I was very taken. I was thinking yesterday about the reading your book that when people look back on their career, the thing that the kind of the kind of key points of their career are always mapped out very clearly, and they're very often the same thing. Is first time I heard myself on the radio, first time we did Top of the Pops, first time we were on the cover of the Enemy, because and Mark and I were talking about this last night. What are the things nowadays that people use to kind of say I've made it? I don't think they're not as obvious, because the beauty of being on the cover of the Enemy or being on Top of the Pops was everybody knew.
Yeah. At the same time.
You could say 20 years later, how was your career? Well, we were on the cover of the Enemy.
There you go. People go, that's
Steel Pulse, are you sure? Yes, we were. Yeah.
I think
it's an incredible statement symbol.
I think almost everybody I interviewed for the book talked about Top of the Pops as that mark, because as you said, everyone watches it at the same time. So I imagine today they are watching their YouTube hits. But we watch YouTube at different times of the day and night, whereas Top of the Pops, you'd all watch it at the same time. So it was this unifying experience. And the next day, everyone would talk about, did you see X or Y on Top of the Pops? And today it's harder to quantify when you are really successful, isn't it?
Oh yeah. Whereas they must, all of them, everybody you cover in this book, must all be able to look back, and then very often they're looking back 20, 30, 40 years, quite a long time. And they must be able to remember absolutely everything that happened to them for about a year.
Yeah.
And, it was like floodlit, for a year. And then the lights went out and it was back to normal life,
But there is this curious staying power. I don't know whether this was the case in the 60s and the 70s, but now the bands or the band members do weirdly have a curious afterlife, don't they? Because they appear on fishing programs or reality shows, or in a camper van for Channel 5, or Sean and Bez are the most unlikely national icons in a way. You
it is extraordinary.
Last, but they're still on TV.
And they live next door to each other, don't they? Isn't that right?
They used to live. I don't think they still do. They used to live next door.
Literally, they would lean over the garden fence with a cup of tea.
I once saw a program about them, and I thought that I don't want to know about these two guys. I want to know about what must be the two most long-suffering women in the world who happen to be sharing their lives with these two. What is it like? Because that's the other thing that fascinates. This is your next book, okay, Nick? This is what you should do, because I'm fascinated by the families of these people. I'm fascinated because if somebody becomes a pop star, it doesn't just affect them; it affects 20 people around them, their children, their parents, their significant others, all that kind of stuff.
Have you ever read any interviews with any of Bob Marley's children? It's really interesting, and several of them talked about how they kids were not allowed to go to sleepovers in their house because their parents said, well, her father, smokes a lot of weed, and it's a bit of a kind of loose setup, and we just don't want our child getting involved. And you kind of forget that you can only see it as having Bob Marley as your father would be fantastic. They would be playing Redemption Song at tea time, but no.
Well, very except if you talk to the children of rock stars, grown-up children of rock stars, they've generally, very often not had a lot of love, because
no, I never saw the person.
Dad, and it usually is dad. And this is the point I wanted to see you wanted to talk about, because once you've been a rock star, going back to Gary Lineker and The Goal, it's the love of your life, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's more, I'm sorry, it's more important than anything else in you. I don't care what you tell your wife.
Yeah.
That is your first love, isn't it?
It's an addiction, isn't it? It's a lingering addiction. It's just like any other addiction. In the book, I interview Robbie Williams, and obviously he's still at a level, but he's reluctantly accepting or coming to terms now with the fact that he is primarily seen as a heritage act. He won't be played on Radio 1 anymore. He may well not get into the top 40 because his fans, or the bulk of his fans, are of an age where they don't stream as much as Ed Sheeran's fans stream him. So he wants to be Lou Reed. He wants to do all of these weird avant-garde pieces of music. He's now an artist, and his art is out there. And that's what he wants to do. That's what gives him the most pleasure. But he hasn't forgotten what it's like to enter a stage upside down with 125.
Yeah.
So he keeps on writing hit singles, and so on a daily basis, he's saying, well, I've got these that may well give me a hit, or I've got this that makes me sound like an experimental artist. This will make me happy than that, will make me happier than this. Yeah, but I think I want this more. So he pushes those to one side because he can't let go of that particular the roar of the crowd.
But
it's
again,
so funny.
To do with
I was talking to somebody recently who had written a song with Robbie Williams, and he said, "I think it'll do quite well," And he said to him, "I'm only sorry you didn't write it with me 10 years ago, because you would have bought a house."
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
I know.
I know that's very sad for Robbie Williams, and deeply sad for the person who wrote the song with,
That's another thing, isn't it? That no one will interact with you on an ordinary, normal basis because they see you as a cash cow, or they don't want to be associated with you because you're no longer cool. So how do you live a settled, happy, normal, sane life?
No, and another factor is that the public won't let you change. There's a really good chapter I thought about Corner Shop, and Corner Shop have no success at all. And then Norman Cook comes along and brilliantly sees the potential in a record. I don't think no one else, if you listen to the original version of that, you'd never have seen a hit in it. Makes it a massive international hit. And now, of course, they can't do anything else. That's all people want. So they're in this bind. Which is worse, having no success at all, or having some success but not being able to do it? Having any kind of creative freedom.
Yeah, finding themselves suddenly on Saturday morning TV, and they have to talk to hand puppets when they were doing the strangest, most wonderful music, but they can't do that anymore because that's no longer what the people expect. The people weren't taking any notice of them in the first place. So he found himself in this incredibly difficult situation, and it's this. Yeah, it takes a while to kind of extricate yourself from that whirlwind, doesn't it?
It does.
And then carry on as normal, and they did it in quite a fascinating way. I think essentially they disappeared for 5 years and came back as a band called Clinton. So of course nobody had any idea.
No,
that's
exactly.
Career suicide, but it's dignitas. So they've chosen it.
Yeah.
That's the
so who are the people who've retired completely happily? Because it's interesting, isn't it? There are occasionally examples. Bill Wyman says, that's it, I'm off, I'm not. And then
John Deacon,
2 or 3 years later, he formed a group. John Deacon, did you say? John Deacon. John Deacon of Queen's a really good example. As far as I can see, he went to the south of France. We haven't heard a squeak out of him since. Grace Slick, I think she retired some time ago. Joni Mitchell, sort of.
Even the ones that do retire, I suppose there must be some that we never hear from again, but so many bands in our lifetime just retire, we'll never hear from them again. Then they're back. Then you see.
Then they come back. Meg White has retired, I think.
Okay.
Who was that? Sorry, I missed that.
Meg White. I think she's.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
From when I remember as a student just being in awe of the Sundays and the Cocktail Twins, and I think Harriet Wheeler and Liz Fraser, they both disappeared and not come back quite willingly now, haven't they? But that's an unusual one. The Smiths will never come back for different reasons.
It looks like it.
But they haven't retired. I mean, they're still got their own careers, haven't they? So they might come back as the Smiths, I'm sure. But They're still going. It's just,
Jamiroquai have been, or has, you know, JK has been very quiet for a very long time. I interviewed him a long time ago, maybe 20 years ago, and I think he bought a place not unlike Roger, you know, the Who's, you know, he bought a country pile with a big wall, and I think he kind of just closed the door and hid behind that wall. And every few years, maybe 5 or 6 years, he will come back and tour South America and then go back home again. But I got the sense that he didn't want fame at all and absolutely hated it.
Really? Yeah, well,
I can understand it. Carl Wallinger's another interesting example. Carl Wallinger, you know, had some success with World Party, but then he co-wrote, or didn't he, wrote She's the One, didn't he?
Yeah.
And has literally never had to kind of work again. I mean, just enormous revenues coming in.
Yeah.
Built a big studio, sits in the studio, writing music all day. If it comes out, it comes out. If it doesn't come out, it doesn't matter.
Well, I always wondered, what did they do? I mean, I think on this podcast, you've asked other people before, why carry on? Why not just stop? But then what do they do? How do you kind of feel that? Because we have structure to our days. I've got an alarm that wakes me up every morning, whether I like it or not. But you always get the sense that a pop star's day is more fluid. They can work whenever the muse takes them. But if they're not working, you know, I interviewed Adam Ant once, years and years ago, and he was saying that, you know, he's got so many ideas spinning around his head all the time. When he was a successful pop star, he had somewhere to push all of those ideas, even if they weren't all as good as the other. He could emote and he could get it out there. When people stopped caring, there was nowhere for it to go, nothing for him to do, and he found that incredibly difficult. So yeah, if you are going to retire, you have to either be very easily satisfied with very little or have something amazing. You know, Kate Bush is perhaps a really good example. She seems to, apart from that brief return she made a few years ago, she's
with the tour,
with the tour, very, very quiet for a long time.
Yeah,
well, kind of reclusive, really, wasn't she?
Yeah.
And
I assumed she'd retired. I thought when they announced those Hammersmith things, I thought that's never going to happen. And how wrong I was.
Yeah, incredible.
It all happened.
But the record she made before that was really interesting. It was about somebody living a completely reclusive life. You know, there were songs about the washing machine. There were songs about the lady who came to clean. There were songs about wood pigeons and the trees outside. It was just kind of like, just literally, that was the little universe that she was in, and she was just writing about that.
So which is pick us your favorite story, Nick, from this book of all the people that you talked to?
I did love the Ed Tudor particularly, because he only had a very tiny window of success and has lived off that ever since.
And very happily too, without any kind of, doesn't have any regrets or grudges, you know.
He seemed, you know, obviously we don't know what goes on privately, but he seemed incredibly buoyant and up and just thrilled to be who he was and to live the kind of life he'd lived, you know, and music had provided that for him. I found Kevin Rowland really interesting to talk to, a bit like with Kate Bush. I got the sense that music was never really for him. It took too much of his soul. And by the end of the interview, he was saying that, I don't think I was ever really cut out for this. I didn't like it. I didn't react well when things weren't going well. I didn't react well when things were going terribly for me. And I think now I'm going to retire. I would much rather have been a hairdresser instead. 6 months after I interviewed him, the band got back together and they announced the tour that they've only just cancelled now. But so they're busy there writing He's Retired Forever. And just as the book goes to print, he's back again.
Yeah. Another dimension to his story, which I thought must have been so hard, was he put out My Beauty. When would that have come out? Maybe about 20 years ago, I don't know. And on the cover, you know, he was wearing a dress. And now, if you were to release that record now, it would be universally applauded, wouldn't it?
Yes.
In general, it would be massively. When he released it at the time, he was literally pelted with bottles, both Glastonbury and the Reading Festival. Even at Glastonbury, well, they don't pelt people with bottles forever. I thought that must be really hard to do. They re-released it, and it actually did really well, not very long ago.
He was ahead of his time, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was.
In so many ways. One of the stories.
How could he not be bitter, though? You know.
Yeah. Absolutely. Gosh, yeah. Because it's all very well saying, "Oh, he's ahead of his time," but he had 20 years of pain after that.
Yes,
he did. To get it now, it's too little, too late, frankly. But one of the other stories that I feel really touched me was Shirley Collins, who was a really successful folk artist in the 70s. And, I'd only heard of her very recently, but she went through a particularly bitter and painful divorce. And as a result, she lost her voice.
But you didn't record for 38 years, isn't that right?
Yeah,
incredible.
And she really wanted to. So she felt, in her words, that she then had to go back and live an ordinary life. It was a very fulfilling life. She had children to raise. She had various jobs that she was very happy with. She took up fell walking, but she'd always felt that she'd left a crucial part of herself behind. And of course, by the time she got to her 60s and her 70s, it was too late. No one was going to be interested. But what many artists I interviewed told me was that nobody likes a pop star in midlife. We don't like to see the boarding. We're not interested in that. That's ungainly. But what we do is a pop star who lives on into their vintage.
Yeah.
Nobody really likes to talk about Tin Machine, but by the time Bowie was in his 60s, he could do no wrong again.
Yeah.
And then Cohen was the same. Dylan is ongoing. And Shirley Collins came back unexpectedly. She wrote a book about her time, about the history of folk. It did really well. She was invited to sing. She was so used to saying no that she thought, sorry, I'm going to say yes. Didn't give a second's thought to, can I sing? She did. Suddenly, she got an album deal. She got falling reviews, a bit like Kevin Rowland.
Absolutely.
But suddenly she was embracing her 70s, and now I think she's 85. And all she wants to do is carry on writing and recording music for as long as she can. So talk about, something, as you said, David, in your book, that here retirement is not an option. It never leaves you, and you don't ever have to leave it.
Yeah.
Because there will always be some people there wanting to hear you sing again, whether it's Robbie Williams in a stadium or...
But it could be that there are more people. There are more people nowadays. Shirley Collins, 85 or whatever you say she is, probably more famous now than at any stage in her life.
Yes.
Because the audience is bigger.
Yeah, same true of Vashti Bunyan too.
The outlets are greater. It's easier access. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, there were only about 200 people who'd heard of Shirley Collins. They just would have been. That's how those things worked.
Yeah.
No, it's funny. I was thinking as you were saying that, you go back to Mark's 4 stages of fame. Actually, the 4th stage ought to be legend, because that's what people.
Yeah, there should be a 5th stage.
I find that with my, even with my grown-up kids, there are loads of musicians that they don't necessarily know anything about, but they go, "Oh, it's legend." Yes. They're just aware that that's a person who's. God, it's surprising they're alive, but they're a legend. Do you know what I mean?
I remember noticing that with the Stones. The Stones was, the same audience with younger people joining. We go and see them every year, and then suddenly it became dads taking their kids to see the Stones. And because you have to see the Rolling Stones before you die. Before they die.
It's more likely you're going to die before they die.
Yeah, you'll die. Exactly. Yeah.
So a lot of the people that I was interviewing who were in their either 40s or 50s or maybe early 60s, I got the sense, and they actually kind of boldly told me as well, that they were basically clinging on, topping up the multivitamins and trying to live as long as they possibly could. So
to get to that.
Yeah, right. To become a legend.
And now I am a legend. I am an institution because I've lived through it. And we were, the more etched their foreheads, the more we kind of worship. One of the funniest people I interviewed, or in a way most inspiring, although he was quite angry as I was speaking to him, was Don McLean, who I got the sense had a very complicated life.
Oh, that's a great
personal life. He went out of fashion very quickly, but his imperial phase sold him an awful lot of records that will live on forever, and he still lives off them now. And at the age of 75, he has a 25-year-old girlfriend who used to be a bikini model. She handles his Instagram account. And of course, the tabloids go to town saying she's milking him for his money. And he was saying, she's not. I'm enjoying myself more than ever.
Right.
Lockdown happened. She was encouraging me to tour the world because she wanted to see the world.
That's very happy to be milked.
He found himself a working musician all over again, seeing Berlin for the first time, taking her to Paris, taking her to Milan, making money while spending it, sometimes traveling by private jet. And you think, well, he was enjoying the spoils of his riches at the age of 25.
Well,
with someone who seems to like him.
In his case, because there's a bit in the early part of that chapter where he talks about when he was unsuccessful, all his friends kind of, derided him for being a failed folkie. And then when he was successful, they were kind of envious and resentful. And so there was no happy medium,
He never found a sweet spot, and he only found that at 75. So that's what I meant earlier when I said, Stoics, we can learn a lot from them, but let's all cling on, because you never know.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, I saw an interview with Larry David on a chat show where he's got a younger girlfriend or whatever. People are saying, so the interviewer was saying, are you afraid that people only want to sleep with you because you're famous and wealthy? He says, no, not a problem at all.
No, I love it.
I'm absolutely fine.
Yeah.
Well, Nick, it's been lovely talking to you.
Very good.
As you can tell, we've absolutely loved the book.
We did.
And it's our favourite subject.
Thank you.
Write volume 2 as soon as possible.
It is.